had been away from the farm for a while, longer than I expected. When I finally pulled up the old dirt road, there was a strange feeling in the air, like the place had been waiting for me. Everything looked the same at first glance: the barn, the fields, the farmhouse. But as I stepped out of the truck, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Normally, you'd hear the sounds of the wind moving through the trees or the animals making noise in the distance. But this time, it was different. It was the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl, like the world was holding its breath. I walked up to the house, my boots crunching against the gravel, but even that sound seemed muted, like the air was too thick for it to carry. The house looked just as I'd left it, but something about it felt wrong. The windows were dark, and the front door, which I always made sure was locked, creaked open with a light push. Inside, everything was just as it was when I left. The furniture was in place, dust gathering on the surfaces, but it felt like no one had set foot in here for years. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I was just tired from the long trip back. After all, the farm had always been a quiet place, and I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But still, there was something unsettling about the stillness. Even the animals seemed spooked. The horses in the stable wouldn't come near me, and the chickens huddled in the far corner of their pen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. Something about the farm had changed while I was gone, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I tried to focus on getting settled back in, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. The farm was my home, but for the first time, it felt like a place I didn't belong. The first few nights back at the farm were anything but peaceful. It started small, almost like the house was adjusting to me being there again. At least, that's what I told myself. But by the second night, I knew something wasn't right. The first time I noticed it was when I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. It wasn't the kind of noise you could easily brush off. These were heavy, deliberate steps, like someone was walking slowly through the house. I lay there, heart pounding, telling myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew better. I got up to check, but when I looked through the rooms, nothing was out of place. The doors were all locked, the windows shut. Still, that feeling of being watched lingered in the back of my mind, making it hard to sleep. The next morning, I found the back door slightly open. I was sure I'd locked it the night before. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness, but the doubt was starting to creep in. Every little thing felt off: tools left out in the barn that I knew I'd put away, the lights in the house flickering for no reason, and the animals, still acting strange, more skittish than usual. One night, I heard scratching sounds. At first, I thought maybe it was just a raccoon or some other animal outside. But the sound was too close, coming from inside the walls. I walked through the house, listening carefully, but every time I thought I was close to finding the source, the sound would stop. It was as if it was moving, always staying just out of reach. The uneasiness started to grow, and I could feel it settling in my chest. I couldn't explain what was happening, but the farm felt different now, like it wasn't really mine anymore. Something else had moved in while I was gone, and whatever it wasn't happy I was back. By the third day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. The strange occurrences were becoming more frequent, and I decided to look around the farm more carefully, hoping I'd find some kind of explanation. I started with the barn, thinking maybe an animal had gotten in and caused some of the disturbances. But when I stepped inside, I knew right away that something else had been here. There were strange symbols drawn in the dirt on the floor, circles and lines, almost like they were part of some kind of ritual. I crouched down, examining them, but I couldn't make sense of it. They weren't something I recognized. I looked around for more clues, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There, hanging from one of the rafters, was a small bundle made of sticks and what looked like pieces of bone, tied together with old rope. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at it. Someone, or something, had put it there. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't good. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but nothing fit. After that, I headed to the fields, hoping to clear my head, but the uneasiness only grew. As I walked, I found more signs that something had been there. Deep scratches in the bark of the trees, like claws had torn through them, and odd piles of stones placed in patterns that didn't seem natural. Then I stumbled upon something I hadn't seen before, a small rundown cabin at the edge of the woods. I didn't remember it ever being there. It looked old, like it had been abandoned for years, but it didn't make sense. I had grown up on this land, and I knew every inch of it. Or at least, I thought I did. I hesitated at the door, not sure if I should go in, but curiosity got the better of me. The inside was dark, with only a little light filtering through the broken windows. As I looked around, I saw clear signs that someone had been living there recently. An old, dirty mattress, scraps of food, and what looked like a journal left open on a makeshift table. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been here wasn't far away, and the thought sent a shiver down my spine. Something was wrong with this place, and whatever had taken up residence here wasn't done with me yet. Things took a darker turn after I found that cabin. I couldn't get the image of it out of my mind, and every time I thought about the symbols, the strange bundles, or the scratches on the trees, a sense of dread settled over me. That night, the footsteps returned, louder than before. I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, the slow, deliberate thud of footsteps, pacing down the hallway. My heart raced as I strained to listen, barely breathing. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and stepped into the hallway. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on me. I swept the light from side to side, expecting to see someone standing there. But the hallway was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I stood there, the temperature seemed to drop, and I felt a cold breeze brush past me, even though the windows were all shut. The shadows in the corners of the room felt like they were moving, stretching, almost like they were alive. Every instinct in me told me to get out of the house, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place. The next day, things got worse. I went out to check on the animals, hoping for some normalcy, but the second I stepped into the barn, I knew something had been there. The symbols on the floor had changed, more intricate now, and there were more of those strange bundles hanging from the rafters. The horses wouldn't come near me, their eyes wide with fear, and I couldn't blame them. I felt it too, something was watching us. As I turned to leave the barn, I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but no, there was a figure, standing just at the edge of the woods, barely visible between the trees. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and even from that distance, I could tell something was off about the way it moved. It didn't walk, it seemed to glide. I stood there, frozen, watching it. The figure didn't come closer, but I could feel its eyes on me. I blinked, and it was gone, as if it had never been there. But I knew what I'd seen. Whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to leave until it got what it wanted. That night, I locked every door and window in the house, but it didn't matter. The feeling of being watched never went away. Something had come to my farm, and it wasn't going to let me leave without a fight. The nights became unbearable after that. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. I could barely sleep, and when I did, I was haunted by nightmares, visions of that figure lurking at the edge of the woods, watching, waiting. It was only a matter of time before it came for me. I could feel it getting closer with every passing hour. The last night, everything came to a head. I was sitting in the living room, too afraid to go to bed. The flashlight was in my hand, and every few minutes, I'd sweep it across the room, looking for something I couldn't name. The silence in the house was suffocating, but then it broke. A loud bang came from the barn. It sounded like the doors had been thrown open with force. I jumped up, heart pounding, and ran outside. The night was dark, the moon barely giving off any light, but I could see that the barn doors were wide open. The animals were restless, their sounds frantic and terrified. I moved toward the barn, every part of me screaming to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to face whatever had come for me. As I stepped inside, the air was thick with tension. The strange symbols on the floor were glowing faintly, like they were alive. And then I saw it again, standing at the far end of the barn, half hidden in the shadows, that same figure. This time, it didn't stay at a distance. It moved toward me, slowly, its shape shifting in the darkness. I could barely make out its face, but what I saw was enough to freeze me in place. It wasn't just some person playing tricks, it was something else, something unnatural. I backed up, the flashlight shaking in my hand, but the figure kept coming. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel its presence pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. I stumbled back toward the door, desperate to escape, but the figure blocked my way. In a moment of pure instinct, I grabbed a piece of wood from the floor and swung it toward the figure, not knowing what else to do. But as soon as the wood passed through it, the figure vanished, gone as quickly as it had appeared. I stood there in the empty barn, gasping for breath, trying to understand what had just happened. The figure was gone, but the farm still felt heavy, like whatever had been here was still lurking, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. I left the farm the next morning, packed up what little I could, and didn't look back. The place I had once called home had turned into something I didn't recognize anymore, and I knew deep down that whatever had come for me wasn't finished. It was still there, watching, waiting for someone else to return. When I first took the job as a caretaker for the mansion, I thought it would be easy money. The place was massive, tucked away in the middle of a forest, far from any town. It had been empty for years, but the owners wanted someone to watch over it, keep things in order. The isolation didn't bother me much. In fact, I thought the peace and quiet would be a nice change. The first time I saw the mansion, it took my breath away. The sheer size of it was overwhelming. The towering windows, the grand staircase just visible through the front door, and the long winding driveway, it all had this air of forgotten grandeur. But there was something else, something harder to put into words. Maybe it was the way the trees loomed over the property, or how the wind seemed to whistle through the empty hallways even before I stepped inside. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to being alone in such a big, empty place. Once I settled in, I quickly fell into a routine, cleaning the rooms, making sure the grounds were in good shape, and keeping an eye on things. The days felt long, but I figured that was just part of the job. Besides, who was I to complain? It was just me and the mansion, with nothing but the sound of birds and the wind through the trees. Or so I thought. It wasn't long before I started noticing strange things around the mansion. At first, it was subtle, small details that I could have easily overlooked. I'd close a door, only to find it slightly open the next time I walked by. I'd leave my tools on the counter in one of the rooms, and when I came back, they'd be moved just a little. I brushed it off, telling myself I must have forgotten, or maybe I was just tired. But the sounds were harder to ignore. It started with faint creaks in the floorboards, which I figured was just the house settling. But then there were other noises, soft thuds, like something shifting in another room, or a faint scraping sound behind the walls. There were times when I thought I heard footsteps coming from the hallway, but when I'd check, nothing was there. I tried to keep calm. It's an old house, I told myself. Old houses make noise. Still, there was something about the way those sounds echoed through the empty halls that made my skin crawl. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just enough to make me feel uneasy, like I wasn't really alone. I found myself double-checking everything, doors, windows, even the locks. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, but I didn't have any proof. Not yet, anyway. As the days went on, the strange occurrences only got worse. The noises were no longer just soft creaks or distant sounds. Now I could hear distinct footsteps, like someone walking just out of sight. I'd rush to check, but every time, the hallways were empty. It was unsettling, but I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal that got inside, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after being alone for so long. But it wasn't just the sounds. I started noticing other things that were harder to explain away. Items would disappear entirely, only to reappear in different rooms. One day, I found a chair from the dining room moved halfway across the hall. I hadn't touched it, and I knew no one else was there. Then, there was the cold. Certain parts of the house felt freezing, even though the weather outside was mild. Every time I walked through those areas, I felt a chill run down my spine, like something was watching me. At night, it was even worse. The whispers started, low, just barely audible, like voices coming from the walls. I couldn't make out any words, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with this place. And whatever it was getting closer. I couldn't take it anymore. The strange sounds, the things moving on their own, it was all too much. I needed answers. One evening, while cleaning out a dusty old storage room, I found a box tucked away in the corner. Inside were papers, journals, and old photographs that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. As I flipped through the pages, I began to piece together the history of the mansion. It turned out the house had been through a lot over the years. Families had come and gone, and not all of them had left on good terms. There were rumors of people disappearing, strange accidents, and unexplained events that no one could quite figure out. Some of the journals talked about sleepless nights, hearing voices, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, just like I had been experiencing. The more I read, the more it all started to make sense. This place, this mansion, wasn't just old and forgotten. It had a dark past, one that seemed to cling to the very walls. Whatever had happened here, it had left a mark, and it wasn't going away. I couldn't help but feel like I was in over my head. I thought I was just going to be a caretaker, looking after an empty house. But now, it felt like I had uncovered something much deeper, something I wasn't sure I could handle. One night, everything came to a head. The sounds were louder than ever, footsteps pounding down the hall, doors creaking open on their own. I could hear whispers, closer now, as if they were right beside me. The air was thick, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew this wasn't in my head. That night, I decided to leave. I packed up a few things, but as I was heading to the door, I felt something behind me, a presence, like someone standing right there. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My instinct screamed at me to just keep walking. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter. The sounds, the presence, everything seemed to stay behind, trapped in the house. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I was far away from the mansion. Whatever was in there, it wasn't something I could deal with. Maybe it was tied to the history I had uncovered, or maybe it had always been there, waiting for someone like me. I don't know what the future holds for that place, but one thing's for sure, I won't be going back.